Hey, welcome to part two from the review of organophosphate poisoning on the Intercept. We are at a critical juncture for food safety in the Farm Bill and Autism Awareness Month. This is the Intercept article on called Poison Fruit. We're going to be hashtagging poison fruit to the Agriculture Committee when we bring up this issue because this is the best review of the scandal around this poison. So where we left off was the fines that Dow incurred for being so misrepresentative of the safety of their pesticide. And we're picking up by the late 90s, when Dow was negotiating with the EPA over chlorpyrifos, more than 10 million pounds of the pesticide were used on crops each year. In 2000, advocacy groups, including Beyond Pesticides and Californians for Pesticide Reform, asked the EPA to ban the chemical altogether, including its use in agriculture. But Dow threatened to sue the agency if it tried the full ban, according to the retired EPA toxicologist named Jeremy Blundell. They negotiated with us and said, fine, we won't take you to court, Blundell explained in an interview. The prospect of a long, expensive legal battle apparently deterred the agency from moving forward. If we had gone to court, it would have taken 4 or 5 years, says Blundell. Instead, in 2000, the agency struck an agreement with Dow that phased out the most household uses of chlorpyrifos, which is called diazinon back in the day, by the way, and may still be stockpiled if people have this thing from before it was banned. They struck an agreement in 2000 that Dow was to phase out most household uses of chlorpyrifos but preserve the growing of agricultural markets from serious restrictions. A few years later, Dow had managed an even bigger threat to its pesticide. As the biggest spender in a coalition of companies, Dow actively fought the implementation of a clause in the 1958 law that had strictly forbidden the use of food additives that caused any cancer in humans or animals. Dozens of pesticides would have been outlawed if it were enforced. Instead, in 1996, Dow led a coalition that helped water down the strict zero-risk standard set by the law to one designed to minimize risk to health. It fell to the EPA to calculate how much risk It fell to the EPA how much risk to health was acceptable based on the risk of cancer and other diseases. As it does with most pesticides, the agency uses companies' own studies to determine safety for humans, including some of those Sapolsky had judged as flawed and biased. In 1996, when the agency re-registered chlorpyrifos, the EPA set a safety limit that allowed the chemical to be used in amounts that caused just a small reduction in the activity of the enzyme cholinesterase. For kids, it soon became clear this wasn't enough. It's standard practice for companies to rely on animal studies to prove the safety of their chemical products. Conducted in research labs, such experiments allow scientists to closely control and monitor their conditions, pinpoint the exact dosages associated with the outcomes, and replicate entire studies. But different species don't always respond to chemicals in the same way, and while scientists have traditionally tested the safety of pesticides by exposing lamb animals to relatively high doses, such studies don't necessarily capture the risks posed by the lower amounts people breathe and eat. In 1998, when Dow was still facing off with victims in court, 3 teams of scientists began to tackle the question of how these real-world exposures affect actual people. At the University of California, Berkeley, and Mount Sinai Hospital and Columbia University of New York City, the researchers embarked on a series of government-funded studies to see how young children were affected by environmental chemicals. Virginia Rao, an epidemiologist leading the neurodevelopment team at the Columbia Center for Children's Environmental Health, chose to investigate chlorpyrifos because she and her colleagues were aware that organophosphate pesticides had potentially irreversible neurological effects on lab animals. She also knew that chlorpyrifos could cross the human placenta and enter the fetal blood before birth. Plus, as she explained to me recently in her office overlooking the Hudson River, these are chemicals that are specifically designed to attack the male mammalian nervous system. Rao and her colleagues, who ultimately enrolled 725 African Americans and Dominican mothers and their children in New York City, were aware too that, like most New Yorkers, the women in in the Columbia study used the stuff to kill fleas, ants, and cockroaches in their homes. Oh wow, when was this? 1998. Yep, before it was banned for home uses. As she expected, the research team soon found ample evidence of chlorpyrifos exposure. 99% of the air sampled from the subjects' apartments tested positive for chlorpyrifos, as did 70% of the blood samples taken from mothers and their children. What Rao hadn't expected was that the EPA's ban on the in-home use of chlorpyrifos would go into effect in 2001, even as the team was enrolling women in the study, almost immediately causing the amount of chemical in the bodies to drop. We have this beautiful side effect slide that shows the concentration levels going down right after the ban, and in 2006, almost all the levels were non-detectable. Gosh, that's great! This accident of timing divided her study population into two: children who were born before the ban and had relatively high levels of exposure, and those born after, whose levels were much lower. When the Columbia researchers compared the otherwise indistinguishable groups, they found clear differences. The babies who were exposed to more of the chemical tended to be smaller, having poor reflexes, and weigh less. In fact, the babies with the highest level of chlorpyrifos were about a half-pound lighter on average than those with the lowest levels. What's more, even though the exposures happened before birth, their effects seemed to last for years. Rao and her colleagues kept following the children enrolled in the study and found that at age 3, those who had higher chlorpyrifos levels in there were more likely to lag in terms of both motor and mental development. The differences weren't subtle. The children in the higher exposure group were more than twice as likely to be mentally delayed, more than 5 times as likely to have symptoms of pervasive developmental disorder, a diagnosis that was later folded into autism spectrum disorder, more than 6 times more likely to have ADHD type symptoms, and 11 times more likely, 11 times as likely to have symptoms of other attention disorders. This is astounding. Okay? Look at this. Okay? From a presentation by Virginia Rao of Columbia University Center for Children's Environmental Health, based on a study of 317 children in New York City, children who were asked to perform freehand motor tests called the Archimedes spiral. Children in the group with the high chlorpyrifos exposure had higher rates of clinically meaningful tremor. Ay, ay, ay. Oh, God. See that? What are we at? Okay, only 8 minutes. I hope I'm going faster than last time. This is really productive for your workouts, for your health advocacy training. Meanwhile, the team in Berkeley was also tying chlorpyrifos exposure to a number of neurodevelopmental effects, as the researchers from both teams discovered when they met up at a conference. The Berkeley study, known as the Shamacos for the Center for Health Assessment of Mothers and Children of Salinas, was studying women and children in California's rural farming communities. Their findings were strikingly similar to what Rao had found in the urban setting. When compared to the children with the lowest prenatal exposures, the Shamacos kids, who were the most highly exposed, also tended to have lower IQs, poor cognitive function, abnormal reflexes, and an increased risk of attention problems. And when they followed the kids in their study as they aged, both teams found that the effects persisted. At age 7, the highly exposed kids in Rao's sample had lower IQs and deficits in working memory. The team in Berkeley also found that the exposure to organophosphates had significantly lasting effects. In their group, 7-year-olds who had the highest level of exposure to organophosphate pesticides, including chlorpyrifos, had IQ scores that were 7 points lower than those with the lowest exposure. So this author is like me, and she likes going on about the jargon to reiterate the context around her things. So she's could have been more succinct with some of these, and I'm trying to go fast. The researchers at Mount Sinai had similar findings. In fact, all three groups of scientists studying chlorpyrifos were so similar that they decided to publish them together. Each one had independently found that chlorpyrifos had neurodevelopmental effects on children. Perhaps most startlingly, the researchers were seeing effects at levels of chlorpyrifos lower than the ones that interfered with cholinesterase. In Rao's study, the pesticide had long-lasting effects on kids' brains at levels 20 times below the EPA safety level. Dow, which often refers to Rao's work as controversial, has taken issue with her findings precisely because they show that small amounts of the chemical can have effects. Chlorpyrifos.com, a website created by the company, cites that the fact that Columbia studies thresholds were lower than those of other studies as one of the reasons. Here, a website created by the company cites the fact that the Columbia studies thresholds were lower than those of other studies as one of the reasons the effects are not likely to have been caused by chlorpyrifos. Okay. The company's own studies, which the site describes as 40 years of high quality animal research, were not looking at the changes Rao observed and couldn't have detected them because they were done on animals, nor would it have been ethical to deliberately expose humans to the brain altering levels of chlorpyrifos. Yet, just by using the pesticide in their homes, people were exposed to the chemicals at these levels. The epidemiologists were observing changes that took place as people encountered the pesticides in their daily lives. These were relatively modest exposure levels, Rao said. A lot of people in the country are still having these exposures. All right, we're going to carry on. Zenaida Munoz likely has even higher chlorpyrifos exposures when she was pregnant with her 8-year-old son, Alan. At the time, Munoz was living directly across the street from an orange grove in Central California town of Woodlake. Her one-story house was about 30 feet from the trees, and when the groves were sprayed, the fumes drifted in through the windows. Plus, one of her favorite ways to relax was to walk through the orange groves. She spent much of her free time during her pregnancy this way, wandering past the rows of perfectly spaced trees. Sometimes in her walks, the smell of the chemicals was strong enough to make Munoz nauseous, but at the time, it didn't occur to her that she or her baby growing inside her might suffer any lasting effects. Pesticides were a part of life here. They're normal, she said, as through a translator. And indeed, it was residents of an agricultural communities like Woodlake who tend to have the highest exposure. A documentary filmmaker who recently analyzed hair samples of 6 children in farming communities in California found that each tested positive for at least 50 different pesticides, including chlorpyrifos. In addition to being exposed to the residues of fruits and vegetables, people throughout the country are more likely. Oh, in addition to being exposed to the residues on fruits and vegetables, as people throughout the country they are more likely to inhale chlorpyrifos that drifts in the air after spraying and drink the small amounts of it that sometimes seep into drinking water. Like everyone else living around the grids of farmlands that make up so much of Central California, Munoz was used to seeing workers spraying the chemicals, and she assumed that if the chemical were truly dangerous, farmers wouldn't be allowed to use it. In the 4 years since Alan was diagnosed with autism and ADHD, Munoz has thought that often about the walks. She knew her son was struggling long before then. Alan is her second child, and at just 8 months of age, he'd already seemed far more restless and difficult than her first. He would run at every opportunity and never seemed to settle down. By the time he was 4, he was clearly far less able to speak than his peers. He also had a hard time making friends. His many frustrations led to sudden outbursts. Munoz, who moved to a nearby town of Cutler 4 years ago, knows other mothers whose children have health effects they believe are related to pesticides. She belongs to a group of 20 women who get together regularly to work on local issues. Four of them have children with neurodevelopmental problems, with kids with ADHD, and one mom described with a 3-year-old daughter as having a mental retardation and other cognitive problems. Now pregnant with a third child, Munoz tries to avoid exposure to pesticides. It's not easy. She stays indoors as much as possible and has stepped stopped taking her walks through the orchards, but Munoz still passes them every day as she takes Alan to school, and even as he struggles, he continues to risk exposure to the pesticide. Alan's school, Cutler Elementary, is a short distance from the fields, as everything is in Cutler. California's careful tracking of the locations and quantities of pesticide applications has shown that Allen is one of 500,000 children in California who attend a school within a quarter mile of fields where pesticides of public health concern, such as pyrifos, are sprayed. Holy Shazam. This is a doozy. All right. We're going to break there because I'm at a point where I need to review where this is going. I hope you are engaged and get active. Tweet Farm Bill 18, your recommendations to clean up big agriculture, to your ag committees in the U.S. Senate and House. Thank you. Much love. Mwah.